Good morning, everybody. We've just gone live. We're going to give it just one moment for people to file into the virtual space, and then we will get started. Okay, well, let's kick things off. Good morning to everyone joining us from here in the US, and good evening to those joining us from South Korea or elsewhere in the world. My name is Dr. Clint Work. I'm Fellow and Director of Academic Affairs at KEI, and welcome to today's virtual event on enhancing trilateral security cooperation, Korea, the United States, and Indonesia, which features a discussion of a paper on that subject written by Dr. Lee Sook-yeon. Dr. Lee's paper will be featured alongside others in KEI's forthcoming spring issue of Korea Policy, KEI's flagship journal. And the title of that spring issue is Trilateralism in the Indo-Pacific, and it consists of two sections. The first section explores US-Japan-Korea trilateral relations, particularly cooperation in areas such as security and defense, economic security and emerging technology, and international development policy. And the authors of those papers presented earlier drafts of their work at a KEI event held at and in partnership with the University of Washington in Seattle. And you can find video of that event on KEI's website and YouTube channel. The second section of the spring issue goes beyond the US-Japan-Korea trilateral relationship to explore other key triangular relationships in the region, three of which we discussed last week at a hybrid event at KEI. And those are the South Korea-US-Vietnam relationship, the South Korea-Japan-China relationship, particularly pertinent given this weekend's and this week's summit between those three countries. And finally, the relationship between North Korea, Russia, and China. And you can also find the recording of that event on YouTube, our YouTube channel, and KEI's website. I'd also add that Dr. Gil Rosman, who's one of the peer review editors for Korea Policy and longtime editor of KEI's publications, has written an introductory essay for the spring issue that explores the concept of triangularity in international relations and places recent efforts towards trilateralism in a broader bipolar geopolitical context. It helps sort of contextualize the overall issue. In terms of today's run of show, our author will present her paper for about 15 to 20 minutes. We'll then turn to our discussant, who will offer her feedback on the paper for about 10 minutes or so. And then after allowing the author to respond to the discussant's feedback, we'll open things up to audience Q&A for the final 15 to 20 minutes of the program. I may, as moderator, assert moderator's privilege and pose the first question or two during the Q&A session. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to have both our presenter and discussant join us today. Our presenter and the author of the aforementioned paper is Dr. Lee Sook-yeon, who is an associate professor in the Department of Security Policy, the Korea National Defense University, or KNDU. She serves as a lieutenant colonel in the active duty ROK Marine Corps and holds a position as a board member of the Korean Association of Southeast Asian Studies. Really no better a person to have written this paper for us. And our discussant, Se-young Kim, or Sarah Kim, is a non-resident fellow at KEI and a PhD candidate in international cooperation at Yonsei University, and previously served as visiting scholar for the US-South Korea Cooperation in Southeast Asia Research and Exchange Program at the East-West Center here in Washington, and also as a research associate at the East Asia Institute, which is a think tank based in South Korea. And her research and writing focus on US-South Korea relations and South Korea-Southeast Asian relations, among other topics. So without further ado, Dr. Lee, I'd like to pass things over to you to present on your paper.
Thank you, Dr. Clint, for the kind introduction and for hosting this wonderful event. And I'd like to express my appreciation to KEI Yes, I'll be discussing trilateral security cooperation between South Korea, the United States, and Indonesia. My paper is divided four main sections. The first section addresses why Korea and the US could consider Indonesia as a security cooperation partner. The primary reason is Indonesia has played a critical role as a de facto leader in ASEAN. Additionally, it has a pivotal role in sub-regional cooperation. So trilateral cooperation will not only bolster Indonesia's capabilities, but also contribute significantly to maintaining and enhancing peace in the region. Especially from Korea's perspective, Indonesia's neutral and independent stance toward China could mitigate sensitivities regarding security cooperation in the region. In addition, Jakarta has a high level of diplomatic relationships with both Seoul and Washington. The second part is an overview of their relationship, especially in the security sector. As I mentioned, Seoul and Washington both maintain high-level relations with Jakarta. Korea-Indonesia relations have been continuously strengthened. The establishment strategic partnership in 2006, the signing of the Defense Cooperation Agreement in 2013, and the upgrading to a special strategic partnership in 2017. Indonesia is the only ASEAN member state to have such a relationship and a 2+2 meeting with South Korea. And its partnership has particularly advanced in defense industry collaborations. So Indonesia is the largest purchaser of Korean arms in Southeast Asia. The United States and Indonesia have also developed their relations continuously. Following the comprehensive partnership in 2010, the ties were enhanced to a strategic partnership in 2015 and further elevated to a comprehensive strategic partnership in November last year. The US, similar to ROK, arms procurement plays a significant role in the security relations with Indonesia. And they have a lot of joint exercises and educational exchanges programs for future defense leader. So as I discussed, both Korea and the US have continued to develop their security relations with Indonesia, but the trilateral security activities among the three countries still remain limited. I think the main reason is that the security relationship between Indonesia and Korea is not yet as comprehensive as that with the United States. The US-Indonesia relationship encompasses a variety of activities, including bilateral and multilateral military training, arms procurement, military education, and maritime security, etc. But Korea-Indonesia partnership primarily focused on the defense industry. Furthermore, it was only after the New Southern Policy in 2017 that South Korea began to substantially enhance its relations with Southeast Asia. So what are opportunities and potential areas for future trilateral cooperation? That's my third section. Actually, the defense industry and arms purchases are the most important part of each bilateral relationship. However, it may not be a feasible and ideal starting point for trilateral cooperation due to the numerous stakeholders involved, the complexity of the processes, and the significant level of political trust required. So I believe that maritime security and counterterrorism are suitable areas for initiating and deepening trilateral cooperation, because both Korea and the US have emphasized and included these two areas in cooperation with Indonesia. Especially following the 9/11 attack, counterterrorism has emerged as a pivotal area of US-Indonesia cooperation. And more recently, maritime security cooperation in the region is one of the most important areas for the US. For Korea, both expanding maritime security cooperation and strengthening counterterrorism efforts are included in its Indo-Pacific strategy. In this presentation, I'd like to emphasize a few points and considerations regarding what and how we collaborated. First, as trilateral cooperation is new and just beginning, it is more effective to integrate existing activities between the ROK and Indonesia, as well as the US and Indonesia, into a trilateral framework. This approach can be implemented more efficiently and quickly than creating entirely new trilateral initiatives, and it can be applied to both maritime security and counterterrorism cooperation. However, Indonesia is not a claimant in the South China Sea dispute, and both Jakarta and Seoul do not favor security cooperation directly targeting China. So we'd better initiate cooperation at a lower level. When considering these two things in terms of what to cooperate on, I'd like to emphasize strengthening the capabilities of the Coast Guard, because the threats Indonesia currently faces, such as transnational crimes, terrorism, piracy, and illegal fishing, all things are primarily the responsibility of maritime law enforcement agencies rather than the Navy. And those threats are critical for Korea and the US as well. In particular, we all recognize the significance of enhancing the capabilities of the Coast Guard in Southeast Asia. It is essential not only for countering China's aggressive maritime claims, but also for combating illegal fishing and transnational crimes. Next, regarding how to cooperate, I have mentioned integrating each existing bilateral cooperation into a trilateral framework. For example, it would be this way. The Indonesian Coast Guard is established in 2014, requires cooperation with experienced countries. So in 2015 and 2018, Indonesia launched initiatives with Washington and Seoul, respectively, to enhance its expertise and capabilities. Additionally, in April this year, the US and Korean Coast Guard agreed to improve their joint efforts to and expand their cooperation to include more countries. So, in summary, these three bilateral cooperations can be easily integrated and developed into a trilateral level. Another point concerning how to is expanding to include additional Southeast Asian countries. For example, the US, Japan, Philippines Coast Guard cooperation was launched in 2022 with a focus on enhancing the Philippine capabilities. Last year, their joint training expanded to include Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam. Similarly, the US-Korean effort to build Indonesian capacity could be expanded multilaterally. My final section in my paper concerns the potential challenges in initiating, maintaining, and developing trilateral cooperation. I believe the most important thing, especially in security cooperation, is to maintain mutual trust. However, the different core interests and foreign policy of each country, along with the potential for policy changes following electoral outcomes, can pose significant challenges to this cooperation. Various factors and issues of each country can affect mutual trust. Regarding South Korea, it may concern the sustainability and ambiguity of its foreign policy. The Yoon Suk-yeol administration has expanded the regional scope of its foreign policy to the Indo-Pacific. However, some domestic skeptics still question South Korea's ability and willingness to engage, pointing out its limited resources and vulnerabilities. As you know, there are two key considerations in these discussions: deterring North Korea and managing relations with China. The DPRK is escalating its military provocations, which could limit the ROK's ability and resources to contribute to regional issues and international cooperation. Furthermore, there are voices in Korea pushing for a more balanced approach to China due to significant economic ties and the need to address Pyongyang. Domestic politics are also critical. After losing the general election, President Yoon may need to focus more on domestic issues and contend with an opposition-led assembly. This could potentially weaken international partners' trust in ROK's ability and commitment to implement the Indo-Pacific strategy. The same goes for Washington. Depending on the outcome of this year's presidential election, the level of engagement with Southeast Asia and beyond the Indo-Pacific could change significantly. Additionally, ROK's resources for contributing to the Indo-Pacific could also change depending on the new president's alliance strategy. So whether in Seoul or Washington, such a change in engagement level is likely to undermine political trust and diminish the momentum of trilateral cooperation. As for Indonesia, the policy of the new president could be important. As Indonesia is becoming one of Asia's rising power, he may seek to benefit from both the US and China without getting involved in their rivalry. Consequently, the US may seek collaboration with a more reliable partner, especially in terms of countering China. On the Korean side, the KIEP 21 fighter jet project affects its credibility with Indonesia. In 2016, Indonesia agreed to finance about 20% of the project cost, but currently owes Korea over $700 million. Recently, Indonesia proposed to reduce its financial contribution to about 1/3 of the originally agreed amount. But as you know, Korea is expected to accept it. Definitely, this could undermine trust between the two countries. So in light of all these challenges, it is essential that the three countries engage in a strategic dialogue to understand each other's fundamental interests. And the development of mutual trust is most important in building a reliable security partnership between them. Yes, I will stop there and welcome comment and question.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. Your comments were as well organized and clear as your paper was. Thank you very much for the rundown. I want to pass things over to Sarah Kim, as our discussant.
Thank you, Dr. Work. Before I begin, I just want to express my gratitude to KEI once again for hosting this very timely event, as well as to Professor Lee for her wonderful paper and presentation. I personally learned a great deal just from reading it. And it's to my understanding, the paper is largely structured into following the courses of developments in US Indonesia and South Korea Indonesia relations and examining room for potential growth and trilateral cooperation. And I believe it does a great job providing specific areas of collaboration for future cooperation, including maritime security and counterterrorism. And Professor Lee makes a particularly strong case that these two areas are great initial points for increased cooperation, enabling it to start off on light non-traditional security realms and gradually evolve more into traditional security areas. And she says such a gradual transition is important because of Indonesia's ongoing neutrality amid US and China, as well as its tendency to act collectively within the ASEAN. And I agree with her that maritime security and counterterrorism are important for trilateral cooperation and that they're both highlighted in each of US and South Korea's respective Indo-Pacific strategies. So in terms of my comments, I would like to pose a couple of questions and also provide room for discussion on the following three key areas. The first being trust building, second being maximization of existing resources, and third, highlighting the trilateral nature of the cooperative framework by understanding Indonesia as well as South Korea's role as the middle power. And so going on with the first set of comments on issues with trust building. And Professor Lee, as in her presentation, mentioned that mutual trust is fundamental and is at the core of this trilateral cooperation. But I just wanted to hear more from her on this. And this is because mutual trust really is at the backbone of defense cooperation, in particular, due to the exchange of sensitive information and technology for advanced weaponry development. And it's especially important in cases such as Indonesia, which Professor Lee mentions strives for strategic independence instead of alignment. So my first question is, how can we ensure that such an inflow of sensitive information and technology into Indonesia will be well protected and put to good use? What are some follow-up and liability measures that can be placed on ongoing cooperative projects? And how can the US, ROK, and Indonesia agree to have these establish them mutually? And this question is particularly in reference to the cases that Professor Lee mentioned, in which there have been, disputes regarding the existing agreements and funds, such as in the case of the KF-21 jet development project with Korea, as well as other cases where Indonesian nationals were even accused of leaking sensitive technology. And I think something that we might consider also is establishing some sort of real-time communication between or among high-level officials and leaders. But I hope to hear more on this from Professor Lee. And my second set of comments is on maximizing existing resources and capabilities, as well as perhaps extending cooperation to potential third parties. And in her paper and in her presentation, Professor Lee mentioned a great set of recommendations for trilateral cooperation that is a combination of both existing and new mechanisms. So for instance, she suggests that South Korea join in on some of US-Indonesia joint exercises, while also look into establishing new US-Korea-Indonesia programs. But in addition to these, as she highlighted, I wanted to hear more about the specific capabilities that are already in place and how they could be utilized to enhance trilateral cooperation, and in particular, how each of the three parties would contribute to and benefit from these programs or projects, which would help to set the overall incentive for trilateral cooperation. And as she mentioned, I just want to add that existing capabilities not only provide great pedestals for jumpstarting relatively novel cooperation such as this, but are also critical at a time when resources are relatively more constrained, for countries due to domestic matters, such as the upcoming presidential election in the US. And one interesting area of cooperation that Professor Lee did mention in her paper, which deserves more attention, is satellite detection information sharing and promoting MDA. And I think it's a good area and good example where there are already existing capabilities as well as enough incentive for cooperation on all three parties. So, for instance, while Korea may be developing its own MDA system, it will certainly benefit from trilateral cooperation in satellite detection because the US is equipped with more advanced capabilities vis-a-vis NASA. And satellite detection would also be of great interest to Indonesia as well, because as in the Coast Guard example, as she mentioned, it harbors both non-traditional and traditional security realms in assisting, monitoring fish movement, climate change, as well as combating sea-based terrorism. So that's just one example that I just took out of your paper. But if you want to expand on anything that you mentioned, that would be great as well. And with another aspect to this topic is that we can examine further cooperation or extending cooperation to third parties or other partners that have high capacities in this region, such as Japan, in order to maximize productivity and also examine how viable this is. And I mention this because according to the ISEAS surveys that they put out every year, countries like Japan continue to be viewed by ASEAN countries as having more strategic relevance and leadership in championing a rules-based order and free trade than Korea. And furthermore, US, Japan, and Indonesia are already showcasing existing cooperative mechanisms in the non-traditional security sector, such as in critical minerals, shutting down coal power plants, which maybe Korea can also potentially take part in. But that being said, an obstacle would be that cooperation with Japan will have to be at an extent where it's not viewed as an act to counter China, because as Professor Lee mentioned, Indonesia as well as Korea are both sensitive on that front. So, Professor Lee, if you could expand on any of these areas as well, I'd be very grateful. And my third and final set of comments addresses looking at all of this from a more trilateral perspective and further understanding what Indonesia wants from each of its partners, as well as how South Korea could more actively contribute as a middle power in bridging US and Indonesia. And as I mentioned before, I think Professor Lee's paper is structured more into following the courses of development in US-Indonesia and ROK-Indonesia relations, and viably so because trilateral cooperation among these countries is relatively more upcoming. But I believe we can further discuss ways to make this trilateral form of cooperation more sustainable. And there are a couple of important messages that I think Professor Lee highlights throughout our paper regarding Indonesia as a cooperative partner for the US and Korea. One being that Indonesia will always balance between the US and China. And two, Indonesia prefers an ASEAN-based multilateral effort instead of an individual-based one. And three, which perhaps I think is one of the most significant recommendations, is that Indonesia and other ASEAN countries wish to see a continued interest of the US and ROK in the region, rather than shifts in regional policy according to different administrations. And looking at trilateral cooperation in the long run, I believe that the portrayal of continued interest in Indonesia and the region by the US and ROK will be critical, not only in solidifying trilateral cooperation, but also cooperation with ASEAN as a whole. So my question is, how can the US and South Korea portray continued interest in Indonesia and elevate trilateral cooperation and trust? What kind of advantages might Korea have in this as a middle power in bridging the US and Indonesia? And in terms of showing continued interest, I believe, as Professor Lee mentioned in her paper, that for South Korea, this would mean increasing domestic support for the newly announced KASI, or the Korea-ASEAN Solidarity Initiative, by definitely providing more substance and following up with actions that extend beyond its said 8 core lines of effort. And in my view, one of KASI's major shortcomings, echoes actually one of those of the previous New Southern policy, in that it's still largely economically oriented. And while ODA is a large portion of KASI, I think it will help Korea to provide more detailed agendas of other projects underlying it, because there are so many, infrastructural, you name it, there are so many, as well as implement proper monitoring over these, which the New Southern policy actually wasn't able to do over the years as well. So, and I think this relates to South Korea playing a middle power role as well. One of the example could be South Korea following up more actively with its dialogue on environment and climate change that it established with ASEAN in 2020 under the New Southern Policy. And this is important, I think, because smaller countries like Indonesia do need middle power states like Korea to voice their concerns, even oftentimes in these spheres where narratives are often set by dominant countries. So all in all, I'm hoping that increased trilateral cooperation with the US and Indonesia will help to lock down parts of KASI and increase liability of these projects that will hopefully go unaltered even despite transitions in the next administration. So those are my three large set of comments. I've tried to provide a lot of room for discussion. So Professor Lee, if she could, respond to any of them, I'd be very, very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you, Se-young. That was really comprehensive, trust building and maximizing resources, and then a sort of a more trilateral perspective, or sort of making it more cohesive and sustainable over time. Lots of food for thought. Dr. Lee, I want to give you a chance to respond to the broad range of issues and questions that Se-young helpfully posed.
Yes, thank you, Sarah, for commenting on the very important point that I didn't cover sufficiently in my paper. It's a shame that I can't improve my paper with your feedback. I respond in order of the areas you discussed briefly. Regarding the KIEP 21 project, South Korea decided to collaborate with Indonesia in order to reduce development costs and link it to potential exports. Arms experts and procurement are crucial in terms of interoperability in military relations. But the joint development and transfer of advanced weaponry must be appropriate approached deliberately, I think. So whether Indonesia's request or not, the most important follow measures is to thoroughly investigate the issue of Indonesian technicians leaking internal documents and data, regardless of the project schedule or experts. It is important. If any serious and sensitive data or document is discovered on the USB, the government must take action and protest against Indonesia, as well as readjust Indonesia's finance constitution to reflect them. And just in my opinion, rather than transferring 1/3 of the technology, Korea would be better off transferring only minimal technical data while reducing the export price of KIEP 21. I believe there are clear distinctions between how much the Indonesian military purchase from Korea and how much Korean can trust Indonesia in highly sensitive military areas. Additionally, strategic independence and mutual trust, especially in defense, I believe these are not related to each other. Indeed, many ASEAN countries, including Indonesia, prioritize strategic autonomy. However, it is difficult to believe that Indonesia's traditional diplomatic stance or strategic independence have influenced its conduct regarding the KIEP 21 project, for example. While Korea also adopts strategic ambiguity in certain situations and issues, but it never fails to respect agreements made with the United States for its own interests. And establishing a communication channel among high-level officials is truly important, I believe. I mean, of course, senior officials from both countries have likely been communicating about the KIEP 21 up to now. However, given that Indonesia has defaulted on its contributions and requested reductions since 2018, some in Korea insist that closer consultations between the two countries could have prevented such significant issues from arising 5 years later. Therefore, not only institutionalization, but also real-time communication channels and also crucial. And the second response is about the specific mechanisms to enhance trilateral cooperation. I write down about the MDA, Maritime Domain Awareness Cooperation, and extending cooperation to internationally. But MDA has recently become a key area of maritime security cooperation. I understand the importance of cooperating for real-time maritime surveillance and information sharing, but I have not outlined the specific and concrete ways for trilateral or multilateral MDA cooperation in my paper, because Korea is still in the developmental phase in establishing an MDA system. To elaborate further, the Korean MDA is primarily led by the Coast Guard. The government plans to integrate maritime information collected and managed by relevant agencies, including the Coast Guard and the Navy, by the next year. And then it will develop MDA platform and enhance information sharing with regional partners by digitalizing maritime data and creating an AI-based system for situational awareness assessment and forecasting by 2026. According to this plan, dozens of satellites are scheduled to launch. Furthermore, the defense industry and the Coast Guard, in collaboration with academics, have started exploring international cooperation strategy in MDA. So it is currently difficult to specify how Korea will contribute to MDA cooperation. However, it is certain that once Korea enhances its satellite surveillance capabilities, we will actively engage in MDA cooperation with more countries. For instance, as Sarah mentioned, a Korean maritime satellite launched in 2020 passes daily over the region of Australia and Southeast Asia. So in 2023, these advancements led to the ODA project titled Managing Indonesia's Water Using Korea's Geostationary Satellites. Korea provides Indonesia with satellite data and offers expert training through the ODA. But regarding the additional partner, we may think Japan. Yeah, it is true that Korea lacks experience in cooperation in Southeast Asia and MDA capabilities compared to Japan. And it is also true that Japan has been consistently involved in Southeast Asia since the 1970s. And as a result, ASEAN countries a high level of trust in Japan. So if Japan participates in regional cooperation or our trilateral cooperation, it could generate a significant synergy. However, we know that Japan's recent involvement in this region is to counter China. Even Japan's OSA, Official Security Assistance, OSA carries such implications to counter China. Therefore, if Japan participates in trilateral cooperation, it would be perceived as Korea, US, Japan plus Indonesia, rather than Korea, US, Indonesia plus Japan. So both Indonesia and South Korea would find this cooperation kind of sensitive. Well, of course, this is limited to security cooperation. If the three countries collaborate in areas such as economics, energy, environment, and educational exchanges, I believe they would all welcome the participations, not only Japan, but also other nations, of course. So while my paper focuses on security cooperation, there are indeed numerous opportunities for collaboration among the three countries in areas beyond security. And the last topic, you commented on concerns understanding Indonesia's needs, but it is also related to Korea's ASEAN policy as well as mutual trust. I think I couldn't agree with you more. Most Southeast Asian nations recognize and are concerned China's influence, but they all want to benefit through cooperation with China. Therefore, they favor continuous engagement by external countries, including the United States, to counterbalance China's dominance. In that respect, what they want to see is continuity and consistency in their partners' engagement policies. However, the extent of the Korean government's engagement in the region has varied with each administration. Although recent initiatives, the New Southern Policy and KIEP, provide some continuity, ASEAN countries find it difficult to the differences between the two policies. Of course, in democracy, a newly elected government typically tries to differentiate itself by adopting different policies from its predecessor. However, such policy changes can undermine the trust of regional partners. For example, on the other hand, after President Biden took office, he not only continued the Indo-Pacific strategy initiated under President Trump, but further development Indo-Pacific strategy. As a result, I believe nations worldwide has gained greater trust in the United States' commitment to the Indo-Pacific and understand its resolve to counter China more clearly. Therefore, for South Korea's foreign policies, such as KIEP, Trilateral Cooperation, and the Indo-Pacific Strategy, to be successful and gain trust, I believe three aspects are needed. The first is more specific action plan. Of course, the Indo-Pacific Strategy Action Plan was released last December, and KIEP has also several core lines of effort, but much of it is not concrete. The second is consistency and continuity. Sarah and I discussed. at least key initiatives that are important to partners countries need to be continued unearthed despite transitions in government. The third is comprehensive cooperation. As Sarah pointed out, from the new Southern policy to KASI, Seoul has placed a significant emphasis on ODA and economic cooperation. Korea needs to seek more comprehensive and balanced cooperation, not only in the economy, but also in security, environment, science, and culture across various areas. Additionally, although KASI aims to expand strategic cooperation with ASEAN countries, strengthening capacity and defense industry cooperation are the main focuses. However, considering that Southeast Asia is the largest market for Korean arms exports, we may see that Korean economic interests are also strongly reflected in KASI. In summary, I'd like to emphasize that whether in bilateral, trilateral, or multilateral cooperation, it is particularly crucial to understand what each nation seeks to achieve through this collaboration and to optimize the unique strength that each nation possesses. Yes, that concludes my response to your comments.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. A very comprehensive response to comprehensive discussion remarks, almost a second paper in and of itself. One of the reasons we decided to highlight this relationship between the US, Korea, and Indonesia, sort of incipient relationship, is because it is more of a future-looking concept or idea. And I think you rightfully start by looking at existing bilateral lines of effort and mechanisms and recommend integrating those moving forward. So the lack of concrete specifics is in some way a reflection of where this trilateral currently stands. But I think Se-young's point is still well taken to tease out some of those specifics. I want to turn to our Q&A. It seems we've already gathered some questions. I wanted to pose the first question, though, as moderator, digging a little bit into details, sort of following Se-young's point, looking specifically at trilateral maritime exercises. And you highlighted, of course, the Coast Guard efforts. You write in the paper, quote, the perception in regard to trilateral military exercises, you write, quote, the perception of such military drills by neighboring countries, however, is nuanced and influenced by various factors, such as its purpose, scenarios, scale of participation, and locations. Therefore, it is desirable for joint military exercises among the three nations to commence with sensitive and low-scale training that gradually expand and evolve over time. I personally agree. But I wanted to ask, what might this expansion and evolution look like over time? Could you provide specifics? And I ask this because you rightly highlight in the paper the differences in the ROK, US, and Indonesian sort of core interests. South Korea's intense focus on the Korean Peninsula for obvious reasons, the United States' emphasis on strategic competition with China, and as you've highlighted, Indonesia's own adherence to an independent and active foreign policy that balances between powers. This could potentially limit the expansion of strategic cooperation among the three countries. So I guess another way of putting the question is, what are the stark limits in your assessment beyond which such trilateral military exercises can or will not go?
Yes, it's very difficult to answer that. First of all, I'd like to emphasize once again, while we all face traditional and non-traditional maritime security threats in the region, the differences in perspective and interest among the three countries make it difficult for cooperation to develop quickly and a high level, especially in the areas of traditional security. However, I believe there are many military exercises that we can conduct at the trilateral level now. Just one example, Indonesia is one of the main ports of call for South Korea's Cheonghae unit during their rotations. As you know, Cheonghae unit is the Somalia Sea Escort Task Force. Given the mission and expertise of the Cheonghae unit, the three countries can conduct joint exercises of the coast of Indonesia in variety of scenarios, including anti-piracy, maritime terrorism, and search and rescue, and so on. These exercises can be conducted regularly, aligned with the rotation cycle of the Cheonghae unit. Additionally, counterterrorism was also a key scenario in China's large-scale exercises with the 6 ASEAN countries at sea and on the Chinese mainland last year, as you know. I mean, of course, it will take a lot of time and effort to develop naval exercises involving live fire or fictional enemies. However, the more the three countries engage in joint maritime maneuver operations and communication procedure trainings, the higher their interoperability will be any training scenarios, even in contingency. Therefore, rather than focus on expanding trilateral cooperation, I believe it is important for the countries to meet and initiate any kind of training. Yeah, that's my response to your question. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Lee. I'm going to turn to another question. This was posed by KEI's new president and CEO, Scott Snyder, and he asked about something that both you and Se-yeon discussed, KASI, the Korean ASEAN Solidarity Initiative. And the question specifically is, why has the Korea ASEAN Solidarity Initiative, or KASI, under the Yoon administration gotten relatively little attention compared to the attention that the new Southern policy received under President Moon? Dr. Lee? It appears Dr. Lee may have frozen. I know, Se-yeon, I directed that question to Dr. Lee.
I'll take a stab at it.
Yeah, take a stab.
While she comes back to us. I mean, one of the main reasons why that happened, I think, is because the New Southern Policy, when it was announced under President Moon, it was sort of like banner of his administration, and it was one of his leading key regional policies. That sort of shifted under Yoon when the Indo-Pacific strategy became the banner, and the reason why KASI was announced is so that there could be some continuity post the New Southern Policy, but it wasn't to the extent, or it wasn't as highlighted as the New Southern Policy was under Moon. So I think that's why a lot of ASEAN countries have been sort of, worried that South Korea will not have as much attention or interest in Southeast Asia as much as in the past. But one other point that I wanted to mention was that under Moon, for the New Southern Policy, there was a presidential committee that was dedicated to it. Whereas for Yoon, this KASI is under the directive of MOFA, underlying all these other Indo-Pacific initiatives. So there's that there, I think. And maybe Professor Lee can expand on it now that she's back.
Thank you, Se-yeon. Dr. Lee, would you like to opine on the question? Did you hear it? I'm not sure when you went out. Oh no, she appears to have gone out again. Okay, well, hopefully she'll hop back on. In the meantime, Young, you've become our more than able pinch hitter here. So I'm going to lob a few your way. We have, and I think we sort of touched on this, but maybe if you have something more to say, we have two questions. I'm going to sort of combine them. One of them asks about the challenges to trilateral cooperation. Is there a possibility or chance of facilitating cooperation? And in that regard, another question asks how can we enhance cooperation? It's increasingly important to overcome differences in national interests and the sort of perspectives between the countries. What do you think are the most challenging obstacles to overcome beyond anything you might have already mentioned?
What are the most challenging obstacles to overcome? I mean, Professor Lee and I both mentioned it, but definitely domestic circumstances. So for Korea's case right now, there are a lot of domestic uh, uh, problems going on regarding, like the medical field and everything. So um, prioritizing or maintaining priorities on this regional policy, I think, is key. And you also see President Yoon's approval rating declining over these past months. So it's been difficult for the Korean administration to maintain this emphasis on regional policy, and particularly on Southeast Asia. So I think that's going to be important. Uh, in terms of others, I believe, as we also mentioned, the current disputes that are going on. And I think Professor Lee said that in terms of the funding project between Indonesia and Korea, it's better for Korea not to hand over as much of the sensitive technology it has to Indonesia. And that itself, I think, portrays how lack of trust there still is going on between the parties. So yeah, trying to increase the trust and everything, I think will be important. And hopefully Professor Lee will come back soon.
Hopefully she will, so we can at least say a formal goodbye to her. One more, we've got very little time. Speed round, Young, if you could. Are there any infrastructure needs in Indonesia that you're aware of, perhaps related to critical minerals specifically, that might benefit from U.S. Korea or U.S. Korea Japan attention in that sphere?
As I mentioned, I mean, the US and Japan are spearheading all of the coal power efforts.
Hmm.
One other area that I wanted to sort of tap into, I think KI had an event on this too, is smart city building. And because South Korea is a lead, technological leader in the region, it's one of the areas that the administration has also been tapping into, increasing smart city cooperation with Southeast Asian partners. And Indonesia, Jakarta is definitely an important partner in that aspect. Um, so I think smart city development is also a critical area. I don't know if that directly mentions the critical minerals part that you were hoping to get into, but something that I wanted to mention is smart city development. So
Sure, and that's its own good point. And actually, thank you for you did some of our own promotion for us. I would
yeah.
people to go on our website because that event, Seoul Tale of a Smart City, is on our website and our YouTube channel as well. It's a very interesting discussion. Well, it looks unfortunately like Dr. Lee has departed early. Nevertheless, we do want to thank her for her outstanding contribution to Korea policy, which for all our viewers, I want to reiterate, is forthcoming. The spring issue will be out in the coming weeks, the digital and then hard copy version thereafter. And Seyong, I want to thank you as well for your discussant remarks. You've given such wonderful remarks that I might ask you to write a follow-up essay for us, building on Dr. Lee's really wonderful foundation, looking at a relationship, a three-way relationship that has existing component parts, but has a lot of room to grow, but also opportunity to do so, not to mention the challenges, of course, that we've discussed. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. We will, as we do with all our events, post this recording to our website and YouTube channel for future viewing. So please feel free to share widely with those who you believe would be interested in this relationship. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Seo.
you.